Thank you for having me today. It's amazing that this has been a great program that's gone on since the beginning of really COVID. It's great that you also have these going on. Thanks for asking me to be here today. Now is a great time to start thinking about cover crops. Really, one way to think of a cover crop is to think of it as almost like a compost you grow in place. And so here in Madison County, central Kentucky, I think compost is probably one of the most important things people can use on their garden. One of the biggest problems I talk to people about is really, for lack of a better term, their soil seems to get tired. Like it doesn't produce like it used to, maybe because due to compaction or another issue. And so compost is actually hard to find in their area. And so this is one way people can sort of adjust in a different way. And so cover crops are also called green manures when you're reading literature, and they have a ton of benefits. A few of them, they do reduce soil compaction, which again is one of the bigger things I think they do. They prevent erosion, they add nitrogen to soils, organic matter content increase, and they do also attract beneficial insects and other animals. So I'll go into more detail as we go on with that though. So one of the biggest things that cover crops do is improve soil health overall. And we'll talk a little bit more about legumes and non-legumes and what each type do. But overall, they take the soil microbes in the soil, convert decomposing cover crops into organic matter. And that helps the soil health immensely. And one thing to keep in mind is that organic matter in and of itself is always decomposing and can't be built up and then that's how it is forever. And so it's a continual process. And so it is something that I guess it's a goal that we never, not in a negative way, never achieve, but it's something that we continually achieve. And so, by having increased organic matter, we have an increase in soil activity of organisms and better structure and tilth. And so it's really just all works together to make better soil for our plants to grow in. So there are a lot of choices when it does come to cover crops. In fact, today I'm going to be focusing on ones that you would grow here in the area like Kentucky. I've been to Florida on farm tours, and they've had sun hemp and things that I normally wouldn't see here. So later I will have a list of some ideas, kind of more for our area. But for the most part, cover crops can be broken down into legumes and non-legumes. And I'll give more info on those in just a second. But one thing to keep in mind as I go forward is you don't have to just choose one cover crop above all else. And so you could do a legume and a non-legume. You could do two legumes. But gardening catalogs have lots of different mixes, or you can even mix something yourself. To the right there, I believe that is crimson clover and I think oats. I could be wrong, maybe Timothy. So you can do, at the end of the day, you need to choose which ones will work best for your environment. I do know with some of the mixes, my one concern is because different planting spacing and depth is different. I would be careful just to kind of keep that in mind as you go forward. If you do decide to do a mix, make sure that you're planting them correctly so that they don't overcrowd one another. So legumes are plants that are able to fix atmospheric gas into nitrogen into nitrogen that plants can use. And I think in my mind, even though I know what a legume is, I always kind of forget that the nitrogen is only available in the soil after the legumes are dead. I don't know why in my mind I always think that it's automatically there. So it's only after the plants are killed that the nitrogen is then available. So one other thing that legumes do is their flowers are good for pollinators. And so when we look at pollinating cover crops later, those will definitely be on the list. One thing to keep in mind if you do use legumes is you may have some beneficial. It may be beneficial if you inoculate the seeds prior to planting with rhizobacteria that can be species specific. And that might sound familiar because we often do that when we plant beans, and beans are a legume. So some examples of legumes are clovers, which we would see to the right there, the white clovers, hairy vetch, field peas, and alfalfa. So non-legumes are basically everything else. So they would include different cereals, grasses, and brassicas. A lot of these actually add biomass, which improves the soil structure and water holding capacity. And legumes do a lot of great things, but I think the non-legumes are just as important. And I'll go into more detail on some of the examples later. But the examples of those would include rye, wheat, oats, turnips, oilseed radish, and buckwheat. I think one of my favorite, probably, if I have a favorite cover crop, would probably be radishes, just because they're so kind of unique in their growth, because you wouldn't necessarily think of radishes as being a cover crop, but just their soil busting capacity when you have a compaction. And I traveled once to Japan years and years ago, and they have the daikon radishes that are like this big. And it's just, I think they're one of the more interesting ones. So with planting of a cover crop, it's a lot like planting anything else you would have in your garden. That most of these are planted in the fall, so that they can kind of grow through the warm weather we have until winter. Some are planted in spring or summer. I'm going to focus mostly on the ones today that are planted in the fall, so around mid-August to November. One thing about cover crops, and this is one thing now I don't use cover crops a lot. I need to use them more, but I'm not great about the end of the season in my garden, cleaning it out maybe as quickly as I should, or should I clean it out so I can put in cover crops? So the timing is important. But an important thing to think of is you don't have to wait till all of your plants are gone to plant a cover crop. What you can do, clean up what you can. If your tomatoes are gone, take those out, plant a cover crop by hand in that area, and then leave, like if you have broccoli growing to the side, or kale, or you have some later crops there. You don't have to do a whole area at once. It can be parts, especially because in a lot of these smaller areas, we're not bringing in equipment or anything like that. This will be hand planted. But it's just like any other plant. You would work up the ground. You're going to sow the seed by hand for the smaller areas, and you're going to cover lightly by raking to ensure good seed to soil contact. As soon as the soil is workable in the spring, you want to terminate the cover crop. Now, many of the cover crops, when you look into them, some are winter hardy, which means that they do live through our winters. Now, I don't know what winters that means. If that's a normal, you can call it a normal winter in Kentucky normal. Or if we get especially cold, would it die back? I think it would depend partly on the winter that we have, as which ones might die back, which ones would not. But it's important to look at that, especially because that might help you determine how much growth you're going to get above ground. And so as soon as the soil is workable in the spring, terminate the cover crop. And you might say, well, how do I need to do that? Well, if it doesn't die on its own, there are several things. You can mow it. Many large producers do something called crimping and rolling. And basically they run a drum over it and it breaks the stem. And then, let's see, I wrote some notes. One thing that I thought was interesting is sometimes people do burn their cover crop, but I probably wouldn't advise that. It does take away a lot of the benefits of the cover crop, and it can make the soil hydrophobic. The biggest thing, though, is do not allow the cover crop to go to seed for most reasons that you can think of, the biggest being that they've become a weedy problem. And so one other thing people do, although I can't think that this will be what I would want to do in my own home garden, would be if you do use chemicals to kill, do not wait until the plants are flowering. And I probably wouldn't want to use the chemicals. I can see where maybe people on a very large scale that couldn't do mowing would use that. But I think in a home garden, I don't necessarily think that would be necessary. So once the cover crop is terminated, It can be left on the surface of the soil to decompose. And I think we've all probably heard of the term no-till. And that just means planting into a ground that's not been tilled. And so this would almost like create a mulch barrier. In my own garden, I use a lot of times we use straw or grass clippings. And so basically it's the same thing, whereas I would normally plant a tomato and then put straw around it or grass clippings instead, you're actually making a mat, for lack of a better term, of what was once that cover crop growing, and you would dig into that and plant it. The cover crop can also be tilled into the soil. One thing to keep in mind, though, is you definitely want to allow time for the organic matter in that cover crop to decompose. And so you want to kill it and rototill it at least 2 to 3 weeks before planting. And honestly, I'd probably give myself more time than that. And you can either turn it over with a rototiller or by hand. In a smaller garden, by hand would work. Obviously, if you have a larger garden, you would want to use equipment. But a big thing to remember is when choosing a cover crop, some of these have a lot of growth above ground, and you do not want to pick a cover crop that has a huge amount of biomass if you don't have the equipment to work with it. And so if you don't have, for instance, a mower that can mow a really tall, let's say, wheat crop, maybe wheat is not the best option for you. Maybe you would want something that's lower to the ground that you could process yourself. So just something to keep in mind. There is kind of a ratio that you can reach. So when you're choosing a cover crop, the biggest thing is, what is your goal? Is your goal, like I said earlier, that your garden is tired or that you have compaction issues? I remember a few years ago talking to a gardener who had a great garden for years. And then after we talked, things had gotten tired. And there were some areas in he had a corn crop growing. There were some areas in his cornfield that the plants were stunted. And so we talked, and he went out and we I think maybe just got a big piece of steel to put in the ground to check how deep his soil was, and he was hitting a compacted area in those areas where he was having issues. And what we found after talking was that he had been rototilling at the same depth for so many years that some areas, maybe they would say wet more, for whatever reason, ended up having a compaction layer in some areas. And so what we talked about was maybe him planting some cover crops that following fall, or maybe even letting that ground go, I don't want to say fallow for the next year, but letting it rest, put in some cover crops that maybe would help him loosen that soil and also bust up that compacted area. And so this is just another really tool in helping the gardener have a better growing season. So I have a few things that I think maybe, goals that you might look at where you could use cover crops. So with compaction issues, you could use a tillage radish like the one to the right. You can use cereal rye, would be another good one, winter wheat or turnips. And you can imagine if they are helping with compaction problems, these are all ones that probably have a pretty substantial root system that would help bust through those problem areas. I just know here in Madison County, we have a lot of clay in our soils. We actually have a lot of pottery places in the county because of that. And I remind people of that. When planting a garden, these are things we have to keep in mind, that we do have a lot of clay, that compaction can be a problem, and these are some ways around it. So with erosion control, how would cover crops help with erosion? I think there's a few things that they could do. Number one, they're covering the soil, so in the winter months and probably into spring, the ground isn't bare, and so precipitation isn't hitting the ground directly, causing the soil aggregates to bust up or to run off. And also, probably if you are on a slight slope, if you're on a slight slope, which I can't imagine you'd be on a heavy slope if you're gardening, this is actually probably the root systems are actually also holding that in place for when the precipitation does hit, so it's not going down the hill. So I mentioned attracting beneficial insects. Here's a couple of examples. I think there's a lot more with the legumes than I listed. Buckwheat is one, and also crimson clover, which we did grow a few years ago, which I think is a beautiful plant in and of itself, but also there were tons of pollinators I noticed all over it. The white clovers I mentioned earlier would be another one. Any of these that have flowers on them, I think will be attractive to different kinds of beneficial insects. So with topsoil loosening, this is another issue, maybe with a crusting soil, maybe if people have rototilled too much. And I actually kind of had to look up, well, why would these certain ones actually loosen topsoil? And because I don't know, I just couldn't think in my mind. I was trying to figure out why these over the other ones. But the way that their roots are, they get into that top layer. Maybe their roots aren't as deep as those ones we mentioned earlier with the turnips and the radishes. And so these stay more at the surface level and actually work to break into there. So with weed suppression, there's a lot on that list. Oats, buckwheat, we already saw those on other lists, hairy vetch, barley, cereal, rye, and wheat. So why weed suppression? Why would these work for that? And I think there's a few reasons. I think number one, probably there's a lot of growth on the top of the ground. And so it actually just kind of shades out weeds. But also some of those actually do have allelopathic properties. If you're not familiar with that term, it means when a plant actually sends out a chemical into its environment that can actually suppress or kill other plants. And probably the most common allelopathic plant I can think of is a walnut tree, which obviously is not a cover crop, but it actually just so you know what allelopathy is. The walnut sends out a chemical called juglone, which can actually cause something called walnut wilt to plants that are nearby. And so there are plants, rye, I believe, is one of them that on that list that can actually suppress other plants in the area. So one other thing we talked about, kind of finding that sweet spot between having too much biomass on the top of the soil, and then also what you can manage yourself. And so oats, cereal, rye, and wheat would be good examples of just a ton of biomass. And so, we've talked a lot about the root systems of these plants and how they can bust up soils and loosen topsoil and all those benefits. But at the same time, these can actually be, mowed or broken down, allowed to die back, either you plant into them, or maybe they are turned under so that they can rot and become organic matter. But again, that's another, almost like the other side of cover crops. Instead of the underground, here we're looking at the above ground portions that we can actually take advantage of. So one thing too that I didn't read a lot about when I was researching this, I know just from a grower here in the county, she has nematodes. She's a flower producer, and she actually has nematodes. Actually, one of the only people in my county that I've talked to that does, and she is organic. And she's actually used mustards. I'm not sure exactly which varieties, but different mustard varieties to actually suppress nematodes. And so I thought that was actually kind of an interesting thing too. And if you've ever grown anything in the mustard family, it has a very strong smell. And so I thought that was just another interesting benefit from cover crops. So while I was researching cover crops to get ready for today, I did come across this really neat tool from covercrop.tools, and this is actually a species selector. And so if you were to go to this website, you start there, and then it asks where you're located. And so I'm Richmond, Kentucky, Zone 6. And then it asks me, what are your soil conditions? So I kind of played around with that. What are climate conditions? And then what are my cover cropping goals? And I thought that was interesting because again, I think a lot of times we just think of cover crops as a way of maybe getting more organic matter. So, here I put pollinator food was my number one, and reducing surface compaction was number two. And so I thought that was interesting that it actually came up with a list of different cover crops that might be handy. I didn't even mention a couple of those because those aren't ones that we commonly talk about here. But not only did it talk about which ones it would recommend, it actually also talked about the planting window and some other topics about the different cover crops. Excuse me. One question is often, where would I find different cover crop seeds? This is just not by any means a complete list of different places to shop, but Johnny Select Seed has a really great selection. You probably noticed that's where most of my photos came from today. Welter Seed Company, Byron Seeds, Petra Seeds, Hancock Seed Company, but also local farm and hardware stores. I know our local southern states tends to carry different cover crops. I think a lot of the same things that we use for cover crops are some things that the larger farmers would also be using. And so, one one thing to consider, if we have a garden that's 100 square feet versus an acre, how much do we need to plant? And I think where a lot of us are starting to go more towards raised beds, maybe even gardens that are 4x4, you might just need like a handful of seeds. And so just some things to think about, with anytime we plant seeds, I think one thing that's very tempting is to plant way more seeds than we need. And so one thing to think about is, and I see this in lawn care a lot, sometimes people plant way more seeds than they need, and then it's almost like they compete with each other. And so, like I mentioned earlier, if you do decide to maybe have a mixture of cover crops, kind of look at the different seeding rates and the depths that the different seeds. It'd be best if they could line up a little bit, because otherwise some may be too deep or too shallow. So did have several different sources. The one from Clemson was really good. I believe that was the one that actually told you like a calendar of when to plant the different cover crops. The Ohio one, the cover crop fundamentals. Winter cover crops for Kentucky Garden Fields was from Kentucky Extension. To the right, you'll see a cover crop field guide. I had a link on there, but it ended up being a broken link. So you can just Google Midwest cover crop field guide. And I have several of those in my office that I've given out to some farmers. And it actually breaks down a lot of different cover crops, how much you would need of seed, broadcasting, drilling, in different ways. A lot of the things that you find in that little handout there goes probably geared more towards what I would consider large scale producers. But of course, that information can always kind of be scaled down into something that can be useful for anybody. So again, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. If you need anything, just give me a call or an email or come by.